For 200 to 250,000 years, humans have been wandering around Earth's surface. Now, the origins of this, the prevailing theory from most historians, is that we started off somewhere in East Africa. So over time, what we did was we go, as we're hunters and gatherers, we pretty much just wander around the world, and of course taking longer and longer and longer to get farther and farther and farther. As far as the United States, about 15,000 to 20,000 years ago is the prevailing theory as far as when people started to enter the Americas and then work their way around and down and so forth. And so for 95% of our existence as human beings on Earth's surface, we were hunters and gatherers. And so essentially what we did was we spread out, we walked all over across the world as hunters and gatherers, nomadic peoples, and we essentially went off into our isolated areas. Then up until about 10 to 15,000 years ago, we invent agriculture. And so the first agricultural revolution begins. And so about that time, about 6 to 8 million people in the world, which is about as much carrying capacity, as much people that the earth could support at that given time for hunters and gatherers. But then comes the domestication of agriculture, and that changes the game. So what we have here is a guy named Carl Sauer, one of the most famous geographers, identified the origins of different areas of agriculture. So once again, the idea that this is an independent invention that happened and it was invented at different times in different places. And so in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, Egypt, probably about 11,000 years ago, East Asia, Papua New Guinea, Southeast Asia, all those islands over there, about 9,000 years ago. And it wasn't until about 5,000 years ago until the Americas, along with West Africa, started to domesticate agriculture. So what we got going on here is in these individual areas, these isolated areas in which they came up with agriculture on their own, they all developed their own specializations. They, of course, the local crops that they found useful, they then domesticate. And so each of these different areas have specific crops, specific agricultural items that they focused on. So if we go back to the origins of humans, we start off in East Africa, and since there, we all went our separate ways. Then we, essentially 10 to 15,000 years ago, we start to organize into these agricultural areas in which we have no contact. So during our hunter and gatherer era, then later the first agricultural revolution, all throughout that time, we're essentially isolated. What I mean by that is we have this area here, the Afro-Eurasian zone, what someone would also refer to, old historians refer to as the Old World. We have the Americas over here with the red outline. We've got the Australasia, the Australian area, and then the Pacific Island over here. So the idea there is we all isolate into our individual areas, and so with the key idea here, the sailing practices, transportation prevented that. We had to walk, and if we did go by boat, we went along the shoreline. So we couldn't go across the entire sea like our good friend Christopher Columbus and all those famous explorers did. So essentially what that did was that created these isolated zones in which everything was happening independent, as far as the domestication of agriculture was happening independent of each of these zones. And so what I mean by that is the Australasian was in the Americas. They weren't interacting with each other and saying, "Hey, this is cool. This is how we domesticate agriculture." All of these were happening on their own. Now, why is most of human history recorded by either the Chinese, the Europeans, or those from the Middle East and Mesopotamia? Is because they had so much more interactions, and thus they came up with more inventions, they came up with more stuff. So we have these isolated zones. But within the Afro-Eurasian zone, we have these different civilizations, whether it be the Indus River civilization over here in China, we have Mesopotamia, or the Mediterranean European area. All of those were independent civilizations that came up with new ideas, but then they started trading with each other. And so as they trade with each other, they then shared ideas. For example, hey, this is the wheel. This is pretty cool. Oh, yeah, well, this is paper. Oh, yeah, well, here's math formulas. Oh, yeah, well, here's something cool. Here's some food. Here's some spices you've never had beforehand. And so essentially what happened was because of more interactions, because of more trade, These then areas then developed much quicker, and when we think about civilization, some of the great civilizations of the world we found interacting here, and thus coming up with newer, greater ideas. And so we see much higher development in these isolated zones in the Afro-Eurasian zones compared to the Americas or the Australian Pacific zones. Further, what happened was we had all these interactions. Further, what was happening was they were spreading diseases. And so over time, this particular area, the Afro-Eurasian zone, they build up immunity to certain diseases, certain illnesses. In this Austral-Eurasian zone, further, you had the Silk Road, but you also had famous explorers who were traveling within. And so this is another way to, when we think about the Silk Road, why was it so important? Well, it was key to diffusion of ideas, key to the diffusion of trade. So we think about these key transportation nodes. It was absolutely critical for this particular area to continue to advance, to continue to come up with new ideas. We think about human history. Some of the greatest development occurred as a result of these interactions. About 10,000 years ago is when the first Native American tribes migrated to Indiana as hunters and gatherers. This would have been right after the most recent ice age. So the glaciers advanced, and then they retreated about this time 10,000 years ago. So that when we think about these glaciers, they're at times, several hundred feet thick. So there's no doubt that explains why northern Indiana is so flat and southern Indiana is so hilly. But anyway, starting about 2,000 years ago is when the first Native Americans in this particular area started to domesticate agriculture. In particular, wild squash was the crop of choice. And so over time, with interactions with more of the Central American empires here in the Americas, they started having more trade, more innovations, more ideas from those areas migrating up. And so then what we have is eventually the largest settlements up until the Europeans arriving were found along the Ohio and Wabash rivers, more in the southern part of the state. And so rivers are absolutely critical to understanding why and where Native Americans would settle. So why they would settle along rivers is for protection, food source, for transportation, but those were the most advantageous areas. Over time, these Native Americans started to grow maize, which was essentially corn. So it's about 2,000 years ago we start to see corn, which is something which we're known for overwhelmingly in Indiana, has actually started to be grown here. Further, when we think about these Native Americans, they were heavily in conflict with each other. So lots of wars, lots of fights over different areas. And so when we think about, we can relate all these agricultural revolutions, we can relate to Indiana in particular when we think about the Native American groups that settled here.